You're listening to Outside the Bubble, episode 37. I'm your host, Joanna Bull, and today I am chatting with Alethea Chang Fitzpatrick from Co-Creating Inclusion. Today's conversation is a difficult one. We are talking about equity, white privilege, inclusion, bullying, and I am going to share a little bit about my journey, about what I've learned, and about what I'm challenging myself. If you are a white person that is listening and you have not yet been diving into understanding power and privilege, this might be a difficult conversation to hear. It was definitely difficult for me the first few times, and in fact, I share my learning and the journey that I've been on. I'm very fortunate to be a leader within the school board that I work for and participate in workshops and learning and really open and honest conversations around power and privilege and what it means to have privilege in our society. We're going to dive into these topics today. Alethea is going to share about the work that she does, what she's noticing with her children who are in school in the United States, and she's going to share insights and her knowledge about the work that she's doing and what she's seeing in corporations. This episode is a little bit on the longer side, and towards the end, Alethea shares a bunch of resources with us that I'm also linking up in the show notes, but she goes over each of the resources and explains a little bit about them, so definitely worth listening to. So get yourself ready. This is a difficult conversation. Thanks for tuning in today. We can't solve a problem we can't name, and we can't get to where we want to go if we don't know where we are. Being really honest, at least with myself, has allowed me to heal from trauma I couldn't even fully name or articulate before, and to build the resilience to move forward. And when I speak from my perspective, from my own healing, what I found is that it helps others too. White supremacy, a system designed to favor those who are deemed white and oppress those who are not, affects all of us. Racial justice isn't a special interest. It is interlinked with all the other issues we care about, including gender, equity, climate change, LGBTQIA rights, poverty, education, gun violence, criminal justice, immigration, healthcare, and more. I don't believe you can dismantle patriarchy without dismantling white supremacy. And I don't believe you can effectively dismantle any system of oppression without addressing all of them. With that, I would like to welcome my guest today. Can you tell me a little bit about who you are and what that means to you?
Hi, thank you so much, and thanks for reading that from, so that is actually from an introduction to a series that I wrote last year called 30 Days of Courage, Personal Reflections on Confronting the Truth About White Supremacy. So I'm Alethea Chang Fitzpatrick. I'm a diversity, equity, and inclusion consultant. I'm the founder of Co-Creating Inclusion, which is a consulting firm, and we do strategic planning, consulting, workshop facilitation, business integration, all with the view to shifting culture and driving equity.
So, Alethea, thank you so much for joining me today and having this conversation on Outside the Bubble.
Thanks for having me.
So as I read these words, incredibly impactful, what type of work are you currently engaging in?
So I am doing what we call diversity, equity, and inclusion consulting for a variety of different nonprofit organizations and also for corporations. So I'm located in New York City, and I have clients who are local, and I have clients who are national and global as well.
So before I hit record, I shared a little bit about the work I do and just let you know that I work in curriculum for a school board, and we are engaging in a multitude of conversations around equity and diversity, around white privilege, and more recently around anti-Black racism. And I mean, these conversations are difficult to have in education. They're difficult for adults. They're difficult for me
Mm-hmm.
as a white woman. They're
Mm-hmm.
difficult for me as a Canadian to learn about the historical culture of my country and things that have been done. Why is it important, especially now that we are engaging in these conversations?
It's important because, sort of as the passage that you read, alluded to, these systems of oppression affect us all, but they don't affect us all equally. So I think it's important to say that. And I speak from my own healing while also centering on the most marginalized. And I think that what's important about that is that if we don't create space, right, if we create space for ourselves at the expense of others, have we really created space for ourselves? Is that something that we really can live with? And so when we create space for the most marginalized and we do it in an intentional way, I believe what we're really doing is creating space for all of us in a way that allows us all to heal from, as I said, from the trauma of these systems of oppression like patriarchy and white supremacy. I don't think those systems ultimately benefit any of us, but obviously there are benefits to certain people. Otherwise, we wouldn't have them. But I believe that creating my vision of a better world, so to speak, is one where we can all gain but not at the expense of some.
So that's big. I know that's big in the work that you do, and it's been my journey has been difficult for sure. And bringing that journey outside of education and engaging in conversations with family and friends has been difficult because not everyone is open to having those conversations. Mm-hmm. What does it look like to hold space or to give space? What do you mean when you say that?
There are things that make it difficult. And I think one of the things that makes it, and that's by design, right? So, white supremacy as a system does not want it to be easy to talk about race and oppression. White supremacy as a system knows that we can't dismantle what we cannot see. We can't dismantle what's invisible. And so, and white supremacy as a system has been very carefully constructed and designed over centuries to be invisible. And that's how it perpetuates. And so that's why it's so hard to talk about. And so creating space for those that don't typically have space created for them first starts with, really confronting the truth about the history of, the world and the particular, and the history of the countries that we live in. So I'm in the US, I'm in New York. I didn't mention, but I identify as a British-born Chinese American. So my parents are from Hong Kong, which was a British colony. I grew up in England, and I came to New York when I was 18. So there are many complex and interesting layers in terms of how that has impacted sort of where I sit in my personal experiences and where I sit with all of this. But what I have found, and I'm certainly not the only one that has found this, people have been writing about this for as long as it's existed, is that there's a message around who we are, and then there's the reality of who we are. And those two things turn out to not be the same thing at all. So making space for those who are most marginalized, I believe, begins with making space for confronting the truth. It's like, so we talk about a truth and reconciliation process. You can't have reconciliation without the truth. And so acknowledgement and potentially reparations, whatever that might look like. And I know that's a scary word for some people, but I think it's something we have to talk about. Those are steps towards creating space for people who have been deliberately and systematically excluded and continue to be very much so to this day. So that history, we think of it as history. It's living, very much living today, but doesn't necessarily look like it is. So I would say that, systems of oppression like white supremacy and patriarchy used to be more overt. And there is now kind of that idea that, well, we fixed some of those things. We don't have slavery anymore. Women can vote. We have an Equal Rights Act. We have the Civil Rights Movement, right? Right. There have been gains. I don't want to say there haven't, right? There have been gains, but I think that when you really look at where we are now, we don't have the gains that we might have been telling ourselves or that we might have been told or socialized to believe have been happening.
Part of my discomfort when I first started engaging in these conversations was the fact that I was learning about how students felt and learning statistics and then recognizing my role in that. Just as an example, I don't remember whose research it was, but research around the types of conversations that teachers have with students, and white students are asked much more frequently about their academics, and Black students are asked much more frequently about their sports and being on teams, and just reflecting upon the types of conversations I had with students and coming to the realization that I thought when I was engaging with conversations with students and asking them about their academics or about their sports or their hobbies, I thought I was coming at it from a place of knowing my students and being interested in what they were doing. And I had never considered any other lenses around how I was speaking to students and perhaps how that was affecting their self-worth and their self-esteem and how they showed up at school.
Yeah, and those are hard things to confront. And some of the things I talk about in my work around this is that we all have these biases. We're all racist because we were all brought up and socialized within this system. And it's not about, so one of the things I think we have to do is kind of get rid of the good, bad binary. So if we believe that being racist means that we're a bad person, we are not going to be able to confront the truth about where we may have perpetuated racism. And it's not to let ourselves off the hook, but it's to allow ourselves to be able to see the things that perpetuate harm. So you hear a lot of talk about sort of intent and impact. And some people like to say impact is greater than intent. And I have a bit of a more nuanced view around that because it really depends whose intent and whose impact you're looking at. Like you always have to kind of apply a power lens. Like you have to think about the power differentials when you look at any kind of situation. But I think it is important to understand that good intentions can create harm, because most of us hopefully are walking around thinking of ourselves as good people. Most of us want to have good intentions, and I also don't believe in, often you'll hear sort of in community agreements sort of assume good intent. I'm not necessarily going to say that, especially to people of color, but I have found it really helpful to understand that intent and impact don't necessarily align.
Can you walk us through that a little bit more?
In the situation you described, you did not necessarily have the intent to be racist, but the impact could have been experienced as racist. And being able to kind of, in a way, like discern between the difference between intent and impact, I think helps us to be able to unpack and acknowledge the harm that we may create, even if we didn't intend to. So one thing that happens with white people when we talk about racism is they get defensive and defend their good intent, right? So, and what that often ends up resulting in is further harm being created because you're really kind of invalidating, you're centering back on your own feelings and you're invalidating the harm that someone experienced. So in a conversation with someone that you have harmed, I would certainly say it might be better to, focus on the harm that you created and to sort of, to recognize and validate that rather than going back and defending your good intent. But I think I found in my own personal process that it's helpful for me to recognize that even though I may not have intended to harm someone, I harmed someone. Or by contrast, someone else may not have intended to harm me, but they did harm me. It just helps to kind of detach those two things in order to kind of understand and be able to talk about what's going on.
Okay, so it's important to be able to recognize that we could have caused harm, and instead of defending the position, to recognize that, apologize for it, listen to the person.
Yes, and I think also for someone that is experiencing harm, so for me, it can be helpful for me to recognize someone may not have intended to harm me, because that allows me to have more compassion. But I think it's also, on the converse, I often see people get stuck on the perpetrator and not on acknowledging the hurt experience. So this is like a slightly different nuance to this discussion, but I think it's important for those experiencing harm to center on themselves and to acknowledge the hurt that they've experienced to themselves, if not to anyone else. If you get stuck on sort of finger pointing and blame, so I'm not saying don't hold people accountable, but what I have found for myself is when I finger point and blame, I end up going very quickly into a victim mode. And what I'm really doing is giving up my sense of agency, right? If my well-being is dependent on someone else's behavior, like I'm lost, right? What I'm really doing in that case is kind of giving my power over. It's exactly what the systems of oppression want us to do. That's where I think the idea of centering on harm comes, on the intent, on the impact comes from. But I think that can be misused if you flip it. And if the person who is experiencing harm has more power, it's a completely different situation to if the person receiving harm has less power. Because if the person receiving harm has more power, centering on them can actually cause more harm to who is perceived to be the perpetrator. Which I know sounds very abstract, but I'll give you a concrete example in the case of police brutality.
Okay.
If a white police officer says, and I've never heard this tried to be justified this way, but sort of as I think about it, if a white police officer believes that they're in danger and therefore shoots an unarmed black person, and if they said, well, they may not have intended any harm, but I was feeling threatened, right? That's a completely different discussion around intent and impact because the power differential is flipped.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
It does make sense. I mean, I'm fairly far along in my knowledge journey. I'm not 100% sure necessarily where all of the listeners are. So I'm just going to ask a couple of questions. So when I'm thinking about, our classroom context and the work that you're doing with organizations, and the fact that, as educators, we're already working with incredibly vulnerable human beings, from kindergarten all the way through grade 12, which makes the students, 17, 18 years old, they're all vulnerable. How do we as educators go about understanding, maybe that's not the right word, how do we go about teaching students to be able to feel that for themselves and to be able to experience harm and work through it? Is there something we can give them? Are there tools or techniques or ways that we can begin to assist people with that?
I am a parent. I have two boys who are 7 and 10. So I do very much see, so I am in it in terms of hearing and worrying about and seeing and witnessing what's going on in the classroom. And it's difficult because quite honestly, like organizations are hiring me to come in and help with the grown-ups on this.
Right? Yeah, absolutely.
So the grown-ups don't have the tools to have these conversations and to navigate through this, much less kids and much less teachers who may not have really any training or background in this. But one of the things, and so my kids in kindergarten learned something called the Power Talk, which is kind of a simplified version of, and I actually don't know who invented it. Like whenever I try and Google it, I can't really find it online, but they had these posters and it's called the Power Talk. And basically it was like, I don't like it when you do this. It makes me feel this. I need you to do this. So it's like, and that's a kindergarten level. And when I heard this, I was like, oh my goodness, grown-ups need to learn how to do this, right? So it's really speaking from your own perspective, right? It's not like you did this, right? It's like, I didn't like it when you took my truck. It made me feel really sad. I need you to give my truck back, right? To use even a pre-kindergarten kind of example. It's about advocating for yourself, identifying when you've been harmed without necessarily making an assumption about the intent, but really just speaking for the harm. Like, this happened. This is how it made me feel. I'm like, and this is what I need. And so I think that's at the beginning of a tool that can help kids have conversations. And I actually have used intent and impact. So I have facilitated conversations between my kids and their friends where, even at 8 or 9, what I've seen is that all kinds of misunderstandings and can happen around intent and impact, where a kid feels hurt by something the other kid did, when actually the other kid had a completely different intention around it. But then because that kid feels hurt, then they lash out and they hurt the other kid. And what I found is just like, and this can build up very, very quickly into a lot of resentment and conflict. And so I have actually facilitated conversations, like I said, with kids where I'm pretty much unpacking intent and impact. So I'm basically saying, child A, do you see, you got to have them share what they've experienced, right? And then I can say, child A, could you see that even though you didn't mean to hurt child B, he was really hurt by what you did? And they're like, oh, like they get that. They can understand that at a pretty young age. I didn't mean to hurt someone. Like, it's accidental, right? It's like if you step on someone's toe by mistake. It's like, I didn't mean to hurt them, but I hurt them. And then child B, can you see that child A didn't mean to hurt you, but I know that it did hurt you? And so from this, there's just a real, like, I've just seen body language shift and such a relief to just kind of unpack and understand what was going on in the situation, because we make a lot of assumptions about what happens in a moment. And a lot, right? Assumptions are often wrong.
Yeah, definitely. I work with a tool called the ladder of inference. Are you familiar with that?
No, I'm not.
So the ladder of inference, it basically looks at, if you just imagine sort of a ladder, the bottom of the ladder is data. So what happened? And then it sort of takes you up through like how you reacted to that data. And one of the great examples that I use when I'm teaching the ladder of inference to educators is on one side, it's like a parent hears something from a teacher and the student hears the exact same thing. And as they go up the ladder, the parent comes to the conclusion that the student needs a tutor and has to work harder. And the student comes to the conclusion that everything's great and they're doing perfect. So it's like the same sentence ended up in two different thought patterns, depending which direction you go in.
Yes, that's a great example. And that's a great example of what happens around race and other aspects of identity, because our different backgrounds and perspectives mean that we can experience the same thing in a very different way. And neither can be wrong. So this is the other thing, is that two people can experience the same thing completely differently and both are valid. So in my work in organizations, one person could feel like it's a great place to work and there's transparency and they have access to leadership and there's a great culture. And another person, just by virtue of having a different identity, it might be race, it often is race, but it could be a bunch of other things too, may feel the exact opposite, that it's a very toxic culture and they don't feel valued and seen, they have no access to leadership. Both those things can be true. Both those people are experiencing the same culture. They might even be experiencing the same leader in the organization. But because of their identities and because of how they're treated differently, it can be completely different, right? Again, I keep going back to the police brutality example because we have had a lot of those situations, and it's a very stark example. But right, as a white person, you may have no reason to experience the police as anything other than friendly, supportive, respectful. They're there to keep you safe. As a black person, it could be the complete opposite with the exact same police officers. And both of those experiences are true. But we always assume part of privilege is assuming that what we experience is what everyone experiences. So you also see this with the Me Too movement and sexual harassment, where someone might say, that person never treated me that way. That doesn't mean that they didn't treat someone else that way.
That's very difficult. It was very difficult for me, and it's difficult for other people to understand that our experience is our truth and
Right.
our reality, but it's not a shared truth. And it's challenging to think that in the workplace or, in the classroom, two different students that are experiencing the same thing are actually experiencing something very different.
Yes.
So what does this look like in the work that you're doing? You work with companies.
Mm-hmm.
What sort of work are you actually engaging in with these organizations?
So usually what happens is that a company, at least my experience to date, and my background is actually in architecture. I went to school for architecture. I'm a licensed architect. I practiced architecture for many years, doing a lot of workplace strategy and corporate headquarters work. So in a funny way, it's actually similar in that I used to go into companies and do interviews and focus groups and surveys to understand their culture and understand what was working or what wasn't working about their culture. And then we would design a workplace to support the shift in culture that they were looking at. So now I come into organizations and I do focus groups and interviews and surveys and an assessment of what their culture is and what's working, what's not working. So the same upfront process, but instead of designing a workplace, I'm now designing programs and policies and procedures. It's directly designing the organization rather than designing the physical space that contains the organization. But what usually happens is a company gets in touch, they want to do an unconscious bias training because they know they have a problem, and for whatever reason that is the solution that that feels, I guess, safe, right? You don't have to use the word race or racism, and unconscious bias itself is a term that makes it, right, that already kind of indicates it's like, we know you don't mean to be biased, but you are unconsciously being biased. Mm-hmm. So when I talk about good intentions, I have to be really careful because I don't want to let people off the hook. But yeah, so I feel like even the term unconscious bias makes it sort of in the phrase itself is sort of comforting people and saying, we know you're not conscious of this, that it's not deliberate, that it's unconscious. And bias just makes it is also just kind of a watered down term, I think. I mean, it's a real thing and it can be a very damaging thing, but that's easier than saying discrimination, oppression, racism, like all of those other words that are sort of feel more extreme to people. And then I think unconscious bias also makes it sound like it's an individual problem and not a systemic or institutional problem. So one of the tools that I use in pretty much everything, that I do, I talk about what's called the 4 levels of oppression. If you Google that, there are many different sources for that and many different documents. It's not something that I came up with. And it's also really the 4 levels of everything, but the 4 levels of oppression are internalized, interpersonal, institutional, and systemic. And what we were talking about before in terms of the things that are invisible, so it's the institutional and systemic level that often is invisible, especially to those who have privilege. One of the first courses I took when I started getting interested in unpacking all of this is a course called Diversity as an Asset with Desiree Lynn Attaway and some of her colleagues. And Desiree explained this in terms of, as far as race, she said, white people are really focused on the internalized and the interpersonal, and they were trying not to be racist at the interpersonal and internalized and interpersonal level. People of color, and specifically Black people, and she was speaking for herself, she was like, it's the institutional and systemic that is going to kill me. And it's the institutional systemic that people of color, Black and Indigenous folks especially, but anyone without, whatever dimension of you're talking about. So it's not, right, it might be sexual orientation, or it might be mental or physical ability, it might be religion, it might be ethnicity, it might be gender, it might be all of those things. But when you don't have privilege, you tend to, those are the things that the systems that you run up against on a daily basis. And I like to use physical ability as an example because it's a little bit less charged and it's a little bit more clear. But if you are not in a wheelchair, you don't have to think about, there are so many things you don't have to think about on a daily basis. Because I live in New York City, it's like New York City is a very wheelchair unfriendly city.
Mm-hmm.
So I talk about like, we don't have to think about what coming, like to get to this room, because I'm usually in a conference room somewhere with people from an organization. I said, in order for you to get to this room today, you did not have to worry about whether the elevator was working at the subway station that you got off of. Or if you got a taxi, you didn't have to worry about whether the car could accommodate your wheelchair. You didn't have to worry about the curb cuts that you had to take, that you had to cross in order to get here. You didn't have to worry if there were steps or if there was a ramp. And so those things are invisible to us, whereas someone in a wheelchair has to think about that every single day. And so part of this process of confronting the truth and it is really about seeing those systemic and institutional levels that are designed to be invisible, especially where we have privilege. So I forget now what your question was.
So do I. I've just been listening and taking it all in.
I forget what your question was, but at some point I thought this was part of the answer to the question.
I think it was about the work that you're doing.
Oh, the work that I'm doing, yes.
Yeah.
Yes, okay, got it. Now I remember. So to me, the term unconscious bias makes it sound like it's an individual problem. And if we just do a workshop on unconscious bias, then the whole problem will be fixed. So it kind of lets the institution off the hook as well by addressing it as an internalized and interpersonal issue. And I think, in the US, but I think in Western white dominated cultures, particularly, there is sort of this obsession with the individual, right? With
Mm-hmm.
the myth of meritocracy. And, in the US, we have sort of this idea of the American dream. And if you just work hard and pull yourself up from your bootstraps, these sort of rags to riches narratives around, like, if you work hard, you'll reap the rewards. And all of that makes invisible the institutional and systemic barriers that some people face more than others. And so when a potential client comes and they say, so usually they say they want to do some workshops. And so thus begins a conversation around, well, why do you want to do these workshops? And then I really listen and ask a lot of questions to draw out like what is actually going on in this organization that has led to them getting in touch with me. And usually what happens is that you uncover deeper issues. I have yet to encounter an organization that wants unconscious bias training just because. Like everything's hunky-dory, but let's do some unconscious bias training just because it's the right thing to do, right? Organizations often tell me they want to do it because it's the right thing to do. But usually the fact is that something is going on that has them backed up against a wall and not knowing what to do. And so one of the things they decide is that they need to do unconscious bias training. And so out of that conversation, I'd like to shift and I'd like to explain that I don't even like to call it training. Part of the reason my company is called Co-Creating Inclusion is that I very much believe that the process of creating inclusion has to itself be inclusive. So I don't believe I can come in as an expert and teach you all how to do inclusion. I believe that my job is as a facilitator and a consultant to engage everyone in a conversation together about what, equity and inclusion would look like at this organization and to get everyone's ideas. And so I'm really more that sort of strategist, facilitator, listening, really doing. So really what I like to do is an upfront assessment or gain an assessment sounds a little scary because it sounds like judgment. So sometimes I say like, it's really to get a deeper understanding of what the culture is, what's going on here, what are the challenges, what are the strengths, what are the opportunities. And from that, I will custom design facilitated all staff workshop sessions, which are, yes, partly to give people a common language with which to even talk about these things at all, create a space to talk about these things. But it's also to gather, and it's also to start a dialogue and gather insight and feedback, which I'm then going to collect along with data that I might be collecting in interviews and focus groups and surveys in order to get a full picture of what's going on in this organization so that I can make, my team and I, so that we can make recommendations about how to strengthen inclusion. A workshop or even a series of workshops in of itself is not going to solve anything. It's one touch point in a whole engagement that usually in a first engagement, the end result is to have recommendations that then get incorporated and turned into a strategic plan. So it might be a diversity, equity, and inclusion strategic plan, but it really needs to be integrated with the overall strategic plan of an organization so that you have concrete actions and next steps and metrics and deliverables and a budget and all of the things that it takes to actually create change. And so out of my workshops, usually what I say is there are things that individuals can do right away. We brainstorm and come up with ideas of things that individuals can do right away. They can go back to their desk and do something different right away to move towards inclusion, but that there also needs to be a commitment at the institutional level to create institutional changes. And that often is policies, procedures, processes. But that sounds kind of abstract, but it's really like, how are things done here and how do we need to change how things are done here in order to be more inclusive? And it has to be active and intentional because often the default way of doing things are oppressive, unintentionally so. Sometimes, generally unintentionally so, because we're all part of this system that came out, in the case of the US, a country founded on genocide and slavery and colonization. Those are the foundations of this culture. And so that's what's going to get perpetuated by default. And what I see happening in the classroom with kids that are quite young, like from a very young age, is that they are it is unconscious or is without their awareness. They are perpetuating these systems of oppression. And those systems of oppression get perpetuated through our kids almost without their consent or awareness. And it's really chilling to see how that unfolds, because what I see now is a direct line between the dynamics that unfold by default in the classroom. And bear in mind, I'm in Brooklyn, the liberal bubble, whatever, I'm in a place where there is diversity and we like to pat ourselves on the back for being better. But we don't get off the hook at all. And the things that I see now, the direct line from the dynamics that very quickly start to form in the classroom by default and the dynamics that are in organizations. And, what we're seeing at the very highest level of, government and politics and in our country, certainly in the US. And it's a strange thing to see sort of an impeachment inquiry going on into the president of the United States, and then to be hearing those conversations and to be thinking about a whistleblower and fear of retaliation. And then I'm having conversations with my clients around how do you hold power to account and fear of retaliation. And then I'm having conversations with my kids about retaliation and accountability. And it's all a continuum on the same spectrum.
So one thing that I just want to highlight that you mentioned in there is the fact that we don't do. And I think that's really important. Like, we don't do inclusion. We don't do it. It's not the doing. It has to be built on like the co-creation and understanding of the culture and the environment. And that's very deep process-oriented work. And you mentioned that it unfortunately can also be rolled out in a way that ends up being bias and causing harm. So thinking about all of those pieces, is there anything that you do in your work with organizations that you think classrooms or teachers would benefit that is tangible and actionable?
White parents And I think teachers also think that if they're not teaching their kids to be racist, that their kids won't be racist. When actually, if they aren't teaching their kids not to be racist, their kids are going to be racist, right? So especially white progressives in Brooklyn patting themselves on the back because they're sending their kids to a diverse school and right, everything, and their kids know not to use racial epithets, like they're not teaching their kids racist ideas. And so they are shocked when their kid tells my kid to go back to China, right? Which, by the way, is the very same thing that's coming out of Donald Trump's mouth.
Right.
But, right. And so they're mortified that, and this is a real situation, right? Mortified that, and telling me, this is not how we're raising our kids.
Right.
And what I learned from that is this may not be how you were intending to raise your kids, but this is how your kids are being raised, right? This may not be your intention, but this is the impact. This is the result. And so I think that the first step is to even figure out how to have the conversation at the first place. Even in a diverse school in Brooklyn, when in the third grade, teachers started doing exercises around identity and naming, even just naming race and gender, parents pushed back.
Right.
And what I was pleased that the principal did was said that means we need to double down. But if there is such a discomfort around even talking about these things, that's a problem, right? It should not be that the kids of color know what racism is, like the word literally, that they know what the word racism or racist means, and their white friends don't. So it needs to be talked about. And I know that that is not an easy thing, but partly what I'm coming into organizations to do is to facilitate a conversation so that we can even name it. Like one participant in one of my workshops said, we've never used the word racist here, right? We've never used the word racism here. And, I spent almost 20 years in architecture. I never used the word, right? We talked more about gender. And I think, often that's the one that sort of is the first thing that people have been willing to discuss. But it's not, in a lot of places, it's not being talked about. And I think that, and this is not something that teachers should just jump in and have a conversation with their students about without getting tools and resources and right. So it's sort of like, don't try this. It's almost like, don't try this at home, right? Like, and there are a lot of great resources out there now. So I think it starts in a school with professional development for teachers, and they need support and training and resources. Like they need to be able to have those conversations themselves before they try to start and model this with kids. Or you bring in experts who have experience around it to help facilitate those conversations. This is definitely not something that I would just be like, yeah, you should just go and try this, tomorrow. But being able to have the conversation in a way that doesn't further perpetuate harm is, I think, the beginning of it. And it goes beyond the cultural celebration. So a lot of what schools do is sort of more the cultural celebration kind of.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Black History Month, like all of those kinds of things. We could have a whole conversation about that. I want to be mindful of how much time we have together, but that doesn't really, that doesn't go deep enough. And that often it can be great, especially if you're involving the people of those cultures in that, and that's part of what they want and that they feel good about that. But that can also be a form of tokenism, that we're celebrating this culture on this particular day with this particular event, but it's not actually integrated into our curriculum, into our how we're doing everything. And so it's still it's not actually true inclusion. It's still kind of othering that culture by saying we're going to have a particular day or an event celebrating it. I think it can still be done thoughtfully, but that's often where schools are at, but it sort of needs to go a level deeper. And then one of the things that I'm really seeing is that, so you need to be able to talk about these things, but often how this is showing up, and this is true at all levels of society, but it's true in the organizations that I work with, is that what this often shows up as is bullying. And so the bullying dynamic may not like bullying is kind of a form of oppression, and it may not sound like it's about race or gender, but I think there's a much more direct line than I'm seeing talked about when we talk about bullying. Because if you look at the kids who more naturally gain social currency, it's often the boys who are white, who are blonde, who are athletic. Um, and so kids are just defaulting to giving that person social power when that person may not even be trying to gain social currency. But that's what I'm seeing also in terms of who ends up being the cool kid that everyone is trying to get in with. And then those kids, like, and then who are the kids that are getting excluded and picked on and made fun of are the kids that don't conform to that model of what is cool. And it may not start as race. It does start as gender earlier, maybe, but it's often around body type or physical ability and some of those other things that as it grows up and as those kids get older, only gets into more like, and then you add alcohol, drugs, social media, lack of supervision. It can go to a very harmful place very quickly. And what I see is that as like we are churning out the Brock Turners and the Dylan Roofs. This is a production system where we're churning out those kids.
I was going to ask you a question, but I think you might have just answered it. And my question is, do you see that bullying happen in the same way as people move into adulthood? And is it showing up in the workplace?
Yeah. So I think, right. So Brock Turner, Dylan Roof, like those are extreme examples. But that bullying dynamic absolutely continues into the workplace and into who has power, who gets power by default and who doesn't. And in a way, in the workplace, it's less explicit, right? It goes more covert because we've become grown-ups. And so we kind of know we have better, I guess, emotional regulation and control generally. And so I think it goes undercover and it becomes more subtle, which in a way is even more harmful because it's harder to identify, right? When a kid is beating you up in the playground or teasing you or like stealing your glasses and breaking them or pulling your pigtails or pulling your bra strap or all of those things, right? Or saying mean things on social media or all of those things are in a way a little bit easier to identify. And as grown-ups, we've learned, right, not to do those more explicit things. And so it goes underground, but in a way it gets more insidious. But the problem is the same, which is sort of a lack of accountability. And the problem is the same in terms of how microaggressions work, which is that when you look at an isolated incident, it doesn't feel like it's that big a deal, but it's the accumulation of them over time that is what creates the trauma. But you even sort of do it to yourself. You're like, oh, I'm taking it too seriously. It's not that big a deal. I should just get over it. Like you kind of internalize your own oppression in terms of telling yourself that you should just get over it. And so that is the kind of accumulated trauma that I see in the workplace of sometimes it's not subtle, but often it's much more subtle. And you might not actually see a very high number of HR complaints because no one incident is explicit enough to really pin down and be able to say like, okay, I'm like, this is right. So sometimes things happen that are clearly beyond the line and you get sexual harassment and racial discrimination cases, and that's more clear cut. But what is often happening is more undercover.
And if someone's been experiencing it, and most likely they have been from a young age, it's just the constant internalization and self-blame and pushing it down, which I imagine does a ton of harm to an individual.
Yes, 100%. And when you compound upon that intergenerational trauma and the history and all that, it becomes very, very harmful and toxic. And yeah.
Well, this is incredible work that you're doing, and I want to thank you for taking the time to have this conversation with me today. Is there anything you'd like to finish up with before we wrap up?
I did want to maybe suggest some resources.
Yeah, definitely.
I feel like the conversation is very heavy, can be very heavy, and we're talking about these very heavy things like oppression and harm and racism. And I think it's important to take the time to sit in that and acknowledge that. So a lot of times my clients they want to rush into the hope part, like the hope and the action. And that in itself can be invalidating. It's like we have to take a moment to acknowledge what people are experiencing. And even just the acknowledgement can be really, really powerful. But I do want to leave people with just a few different resources that might be helpful. Like for me, actually, well, one thing I think for me, there is also hope in the confronting of the truth, that even though it can feel really, it should feel bad, right? Uncovering these things should feel difficult and uncomfortable and horrifying. And I think there is hope in the process of actually, like, there is relief to me in sort of coming out of denial and really seeing what is happening and kind of getting out from sort of the gaslighting that I think happens at a systemic level, in terms of like talking about something as one thing when the reality is something different. But I do want to just mention a few resources for any listeners who are interested in sort of finding out more. And of course, there are tons of resources, and this is sort of my favorite list, but it's by no means like the only list or the best list. It's just the ones that I like. These are good kind of, you're at the beginning of your journey, more sort of white people friendly resources.
Okay.
But they also have, I think, a lot of value to anyone of any racial background at any point in their journey. So one of them is this podcast. It's called Seeing White. And I can send you the links so you can put them in the show notes. But there's a podcast called Seeing White, which is this incredible sort of NPR style journey into unpacking the true history in the US around how race was constructed and sort of integrated into every aspect of our culture. So it's an amazing series. And I would say that, again, like this resource particularly, I think no matter what your racial identity or where you are in your journey, you'll probably learn something new in it or get a new perspective. Ibram Kendi has a new book called How to Be an Anti-Racist, which is a great book from a Black man's perspective of kind of unpacking his own internalized racism towards himself and towards Black people, and then kind of moving towards an anti-racist frame. And what does that mean to be anti-racist? And he's one of those people who says, you're either racist or anti-racist, or your behavior is either racist or anti-racist, and neither of those are permanent places. So you might be flipping back and forth between those, but there's no such thing as a neutral place.
Mm-hmm.
Oft cited in a way that is a little bit frustrating to me, but is Robin DiAngelo's book, White Fragility. It's a little frustrating to me that it's easier for white people to hear this message in a book by a white woman, sort of written for white people. So I usually like to center on voices of color. However, I know people find this book tremendously illuminating and helpful. It may be harder for people of color to read this book just because it's not really written for people of color. She's talking explicitly to white people, but I found it helpful in that it kind of breaks down a lot of the things that I've experienced from white people. And then more related to education, there's a great podcast called the Integrated Schools Podcast. It's by two white parents, but they really talk from the perspective of being a white parent in schools that are integrating, and what does that mean, how to navigate it. And they do sort of center on voices of color or the perspective of people of color, even though they themselves are white. And then I'm not that familiar with this resource, but Teaching Tolerance is often a resource that I know teachers find helpful in terms of, I think they have a lot of just even lesson plans and curriculum around these kinds of topics. And then there are two conferences. So the White Privilege Conference I went to for the first time this year, and there are quite a few people who are in education. So there are quite a few workshops and seminars around, things like teaching while white, being a white teacher, teaching Black kids. So lots of great workshops there for teachers. At that conference, a lot of people recommended POCC, which is the People of Color Conference, run by the National Association of Independent Schools. So my resources are a little bit US centric, just because that's where I am. So that conference is actually coming up in Seattle at the beginning of December. And that is specifically a conference for teachers of color around navigating through these. But I think it's for teachers of color, but I do believe they have white people attend as well. But anyway, I know that's a lot. I'll send you the links, but I did want to leave people with some resources. And the my series on 30 Days of Courage that you read from at the beginning is at dismantlingwhitesupremacy.com. So people are welcome to look that up and look me up as well.
Yeah, thank you so much for all those resources and for unpacking them and even giving an explanation of what they're about. It's very helpful for everybody. And I want to share with the listeners that, we've talked a lot about, we've used the word discomfort quite a bit in this episode, and it seems like a lot, right? There's a lot of work to be done. It's a lot to tackle. I have been on this journey, obviously we've all been on this journey our whole lives, but really for the last 4 years. And when I entered into these conversations about like power and privilege and what it meant to be white, I didn't have a lot of resistance at first. I felt like I was very open to the conversation. And then the resistance came a bit later, and I was surprised in my own reaction and surprised about how closed I was becoming to it and noticing that in myself. And it's really important as we explore this work and look at our students and decide, who we want to be for them, that we really pay attention to our own discomfort, like how our bodies feel, how we are reacting, and remember why we're doing it, because it's not enough to stop the work just because I feel uncomfortable. And it's not enough for me to, allow something to happen in a school or in a setting where a child is being hurt just because I'm uncomfortable. Like, it's my job as an educator and as an adult and as someone that believes in change to stand up and have these conversations with people. And we all start in different places. And I am, a white woman who lives a very privileged life. And I, for a long time, considered, myself to be, the word neutral has been used recently. Like, white people sort of look at their culture as neutral, and I am not neutral, and my upbringing is not neutral, and my life is not neutral. And what I see through my eyes isn't neutral, and it's not everyone's shared experience. And it's time that we really disrupt what's going on.
Yeah, and what you're saying, if I might close with a quote from, I'm not sure how you say her name, but Lilla Watson. It's often quoted, but I still think it's very apropos, which is, if you have come here to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you have come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together.
That's a perfect way to close. Thank you so much for this conversation.
Thank you. Thank you.